June 17, 1775. Just after sunrise. The fog over the Charles River is still lifting when a British officer lowers his spyglass and mutters something no one expects. They built a fort? Overnight? Across the water, on a small rise of dirt and rock barely 110 feet high, 1,200 exhausted colonists tighten their grips around shovels, muskets, and fear. They know the British Army, the best on earth, is already forming up to kill them. By nightfall, this single, unremarkable hill will change the course of the entire American Revolution. Not because the Patriots win the fight, but because of what the British lose. This is the forgotten story of Breed's Hill, the battle most Americans know by the wrong name, and why one hill no one planned to defend ended up deciding the whole war. This isn't just another battle. It isn't even a strategic objective. It's a mistake, a mix-up, a miscommunication that should have gone unnoticed. And yet, from this hill, we get the moment that tells Britain. This war will not be easy. A moment that tells the colonies, we can do this. A moment that turns a rebellion into a revolution. The plan was simple: fortify Bunker Hill, the taller, more defensible ridge. But in the confusion of midnight orders, Colonel William Prescott marched his men to the lower hill instead, Breed's Hill, a position closer to Boston, but dangerously exposed. By the time anyone realized the mistake, it was too late. The sun was rising. The British fleet was stirring. And dust-covered patriots were staring across the water at an army preparing to obliterate them. But if Prescott was worried, he didn't show it. Eyewitnesses say he walked the redoubt with a calmness that bordered on eerie, a thin, wiry farmer-turned-officer moving like a man who refused to let fear speak first. He pointed his sword toward the shoreline and gave an order that would echo through history. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Not because it sounded dramatic, but because the colonists had barely any gunpowder left. Every shot had to matter. General Thomas Gage couldn't believe what he was seeing. Overnight, American rebels had constructed a full set of fortifications on a hill overlooking the city. If the colonists placed artillery up there, the British position in Boston could be choked off entirely. This was unacceptable. The hill had to be taken immediately. So the British prepared a classic 18th century frontal assault. Red lines formed in perfect rows. Bayonets fixed. Drums pounding. Flags snapping in the wind as thousands of soldiers stepped into formation. To the men watching from the American lines, it must have felt like staring at a moving wall of red. The colonists were quiet. Still. Waiting. The British expected the rebels to break. But they didn't. They expected the rebels to panic. But they didn't. And then, with the heavy boom of naval cannon shaking the ground, the British began their climb. The British advance was slow at first, the hill was steep, the temperatures rising, the weight of wool uniforms and equipment punishing. But the British officers kept pushing their men forward. The colonists still held fire. 100 yards. 80. 60. The British expected musket fire. Instead, they got silence. 50 yards. 40. Then, like a thunderclap, the hill erupted. A sheet of flame and smoke tore out from the American lines. British soldiers dropped in rows. One officer wrote later it felt like being hit by a continuous streak of lightning. The disciplined British ranks faltered. Then cracked. Then began to retreat down the hill. For a moment, the Americans couldn't believe what they were seeing. They were winning. But no one cheered. They simply reloaded. Quietly. Efficiently. The next wave was coming. Humiliated and furious, British commanders reformed their lines. They adjusted tactics, broadened ranks, and began a second assault. Again, they marched. And again, the colonists held fire until the last possible second. Another devastating volley. Another break in the British lines. Bodies littered the hillside. Officers collapsed. Drummers fell silent. This time, some British units refused to go back up. The colonists had done the impossible 2 times in a row. But the victory came at a price the British could not yet see. The Americans were almost completely out of ammunition. The third British assault was different. They widened their formation, avoided the most exposed routes, and used disciplined bayonet lines. The colonists fired the few shots they had left. Some men had only stones. Some swung muskets like clubs. The British surged over the parapet. Hand-to-hand combat erupted inside the redoubt. Colonel Prescott, wearing a coat full of bullet holes, stood on the fortifications swinging his sword, urging his men to hold just a little longer. But the line finally broke. The colonists retreated toward Bunker Hill, leaving the redoubt behind. It looked, on the surface, like a British victory. But the British officers who reached the top of the hill weren't cheering. They were staring at the cost. Out of 2,400 soldiers, nearly 1,100 were dead or wounded. Almost half the attacking force. One general wrote. A few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America. And he was right. Breed's Hill, not Bunker Hill, became a symbol. A symbol that the colonists would stand and fight. A symbol that British discipline could be beaten. A symbol that the war, if pursued, would be long, bloody, and expensive. Parliament realized the rebellion wasn't a riot. It was a resistance. British soldiers realized these colonists weren't amateurs. They were a threat. And American civilians realized something too. They could go toe-to-toe with the greatest army in the world and come out standing. This single hill, chosen by mistake, with fortifications built overnight, showed the world that the revolution was not a dream. It was a war. And the colonists were ready to win it. If you visit Breed's Hill today, you'll stand on a patch of ground barely big enough for a football field. Grass. Stone. A monument piercing the sky. You won't see the smoke. The fear. The grit. You won't hear the bayonets clashing in the redoubt, or the thunder of muskets that shook the hill twice and almost changed the world. But the ground remembers. It remembers the men who dug through the night. The men who stood in silence as an army marched toward them. The men who fired only when they could see the whites of their eyes. Breed's Hill teaches one lesson that still matters today. Sometimes the moments that decide history are the ones no one ever planned.